Elizabeth Drew was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, but when it came time to attend college, she decided to travel to the Bay State to enroll in Wellesley College, where she majored in political science. After graduation, she worked as an associate editor for Writer magazine in Boston. From 1939 to I'm sorry. Sorry, Elizabeth. My glasses are broken and I'm trying to read this from the excuse me, from 1959 to 1964. She was a writer and editor for Congressional Quarterly in Washington, and in 1964 she began writing for such journals as the Atlantic Monthly and New York Times Magazine. In 1967, she became Washington editor for Atlantic Monthly, where she worked for 6 years. For close to 20 years, she was the Washington correspondent for The New Yorker. From January 1971 to 1973, Elizabeth Drew had her own series of weekly television programs for the public broadcasting service entitled 30 Minutes With. Among the well-known figures she interviewed were King Hussein, Hubert Humphrey, and Indira Gandhi, just to name a few. She is a columnist whose articles appear in the Washington Post and other newspapers. At the same time, she is a political observer appearing on such public affairs programs as NBC's Meet the Press and the News Hour with Jim Lehrer. Elizabeth Drew has won various awards, medals, and honorary degrees from 7 colleges and universities, including Yale, Georgetown, and Williams College. She is the author of 9 books, including the 1980 presidential campaign, Politics and Money, The New Road to Corruption, On the Edge, the Clinton Presidency, and her latest work, Showdown, copies of which are available at the table outside the hall, the struggle between the Gingrich Congress and the Clinton White House. After Ms. Drew concludes her remarks, she will be available at the podium here to respond to questions and answers. So it does give me great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, and an honor to introduce to you Elizabeth Drew.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited to make an address in this famous hall. I have not been here before, but I've watched many a political candidate make an announcement here. Sometimes it's been the high point of the candidate's campaign, but it's always a nice event at that point. Thank you for coming out on such a beautiful evening. I try to give a lot of thought to what I'm going to talk about when I make a speech somewhere. But some years ago, you'll know how long ago when you hear me out on this, I was to make a speech in Richmond, and I had the flu, and I called a mentor of mine, and I said, I'm supposed to speak in Richmond, and I've got this fever, and I just feel awful. And what am I to do? And he said, never mind, dear. In those days, you could say that. I still kind of like it, actually. You just stand up and talk about the things that you know best. You'll be fine. And we decided that the things that I knew best at that time were my quite recent experiences in covering Watergate for The New Yorker, my first series in The New Yorker, which then became my first book. And then if I ran out of things on that, I could always talk about the Congress, because Lord knows there's plenty to say about that. I was having lunch with the ladies involved in this event before the speech, and apropos of absolutely nothing, one of them said, you know, we had Senator Ervin here last year, and thank God he didn't talk about Watergate. Nobody wants to hear another word about it. So, stomach sinking and brow becoming damper, I turned to her and making conversation, I said, well, excuse me, I usually check this out, but I've been kind of ill. Who is the congressman from this area? And she drew herself up and looked down at me and she said, my husband. So, we know the topic tonight, and I simply want to begin by telling you that with the possible exception of Watergate, this was which we hope and pray was sui generis. The story I covered for this book was the most extraordinary and the most exciting and frankly the most fun I have ever had as a journalist. When the 1994 election occurred, bringing the Republicans into power in the House for the first time in 40 years, and of course they retook the Senate, Newt Gingrich, the new speaker-to-be, said, what I want to do is repeal the New Deal. I knew enough about him, and I knew him well enough, we certainly weren't intimate buddies, but I had interviewed him over the years, to know that he meant exactly that. And I decided that this was going to be a very big story. It was going to be a major debate over fundamental questions, the most fundamental being what is the role of the federal government. Issues were going to be aired that hadn't been aired in decades. Gingrich himself said, this is going to be the most important event, the most important debate since 1933. And he was exactly right. So I decided to write a chronicle of what I was sure was going to be a very big struggle over big questions, and to do this by talking to the major participants in it while it is going on. This is before they have a chance to have selective memories, to forget certain things, while you can capture their moods, their confusions, their determinations, and so on. At the same time, after the election, of course, Bill Clinton was in terrible political shape. So there was a very big question. It's not all that long ago, but it was a very different situation. People thought this is a political stumble bum. He can't put a foot right. Obviously, he's a pushover for the next election. And so how was the president going to cope with this new situation? What I didn't anticipate, and I don't think anybody could have, was that this was going to be such an extraordinary personal story. I knew it would be a big issue story, but I think it was nearly Shakespearean in its dimensions, in that after the '94 election, Gingrich was literally king of the hill, flocks of journalists following his every step, television cameras always on him. He was obviously a political genius, and he is, who was going to be the prevalent political power for a long time to come. And at the same time, there was Clinton in very, very low political estate and being largely written off as a force of any kind, not to mention as a real candidate for re-election. And yet, you know that the story ended up very differently. Their situations were almost reversed. And so there are two things to look at. Really, what happened in this great policy debate, and what happened that caused these two extraordinary men to end up in totally opposite situations from where they started. As I shuttled back and forth between Capitol Hill and the White House, I was probably the only person who was really doing that. I have never seen such bad relations and communication between a White House and the Congress, no matter who was controlling what. And we'd had different parties before. These people didn't understand each other. They had almost no communication. So there was a great temptation on the part of some of the people I interviewed, which some of them yielded to try to quiz me on what was going on. And somebody on the Hill, a Republican, would say, well, we hear what's going on at the White House is that Stephanopoulos and Ickes are down and Dick Morris is up, and they'd wait for me to confirm this or deny it or explain. And of course, I was having none of it. Similarly, at the White House, they would say, well, we hear that Newt can't do this and his caucus won't let him do that. And again, no comment. That wasn't my role. But because of this peculiar vantage point, I was able to see, among other things, the major miscalculations made by both sides because they understood each other so little. I got to know some very fascinating characters, and one of the comments that I've had on the book, which pleases me, is people saying, well, we didn't really know who these people were or what they were really like, starting even with Gingrich and Dick Armey and Tom DeLay and all these really interesting people who were having a big effect on our national life and yet were virtually unknown. I had always found Gingrich a quite interesting man. He has an unusual and far-ranging mind, if a bit undisciplined. But one of the real problems, which I think where his problems began, is he simply wasn't ready for the spotlight. He had been the bomb thrower, the troublemaker. He spouted all his theories, some of which made sense, some of which were off the wall, but it didn't really matter because he was a minority member of the House. Nobody paid that much attention. Like his counterpart down Pennsylvania Avenue, he really likes to talk a lot. In fact, the similarities between these two men are almost, well, not almost, are really eerie. Even their fight with the waistline, the hair color, the coming from dysfunctional families, having doting mothers who told them from a very early age they were destined for greatness, their garrulousness. It really was kind of an amazing offset of two extraordinary characters, both of them also very smart. But Gingrich loved to talk, and he made speech after speech, and he made testimony before various committees, and every morning he had his press briefing televised. This turned out to be a huge mistake, because he was saying all the same kinds of things he had said before, and he talked about repealing the New Deal, and he talked about getting rid of all these federal programs, and he did two things. One is he scared people, and the other is as he came to recognize, he was overexposed. One of the really interesting aspects of Gingrich is that he can be quite objective about himself and his situation, and after he says something dumb, he will say, you know, that was really dumb for me to say that. Or a couple of times he would just retire himself to the sidelines because he realized that he was causing problems. Sometimes, or within about 3 or 4 months, this love of the spotlight and exposure and enormous gratitude on the part of the Republicans in the House that he had brought them to the promised land. They were in the majority for the first time in 40 years. And somebody has asked me, well, were they just tolerating him knowing his foibles? And I said, no, they were really grateful to him and saw that he did have a political genius. He was about the only person who even dreamed that the Republicans could take over the House in 1994. But I'd say in about March, signs of megalomania began to appear. One of Gingrich's close friends and I were talking about, and actually the close friend used that term, to the point where he thinks of himself as the leading theoretician of the Republican Party, the philosopher king, and he loves to think long-range strategy, whether he's got it right or not, and then tell his flock what they should do, how they should talk about things. And so he prepared a memorandum, a document, for the members to take home over the Easter vacation, and he called in small groups of them and tried to indoctrinate them on what to say about the impending budget fight, which Gingrich knew would be the really big battle. It was a fascinating document. It got just about no press. And I want to read to you one of my favorite examples from this document to give you an idea of the kind of thinking he would engage in. He said, he loves to talk about cybernetics and the future and chips and all that sort of thing. He said, if the government had undergone the same rate of improvement as the productivity of the computer chip over 10 years, the federal government today would be providing the same level of services and programs with only 4 employees and a total budget of $100,000. Another aspect of Gingrich is that he had a lot of anger in him. Now, there was actually quite a lot of anger, I would even use the word, having thought about it, hatred, in the House of Representatives. I had never seen anything like it. But what it was about was that the Republicans felt that they had been trod upon, mistreated, and so on by the Democrats for these 40 long years. There was a bit of truth to what they said, or more than a bit of truth to what they said. The Democrats felt that Gingrich had been nothing but a troublemaker. He had brought down and driven out of Congress Jim Wright, the former Speaker, and even Democrats who weren't particular fans of Wright resented Gingrich's role in that. And they set out to undermine him by mainly focusing on ethics questions, of which there are several still in the air, and the famous book deal that he made after the election. So that when Gingrich said that the Democrats are out to destroy me, he was absolutely right. They were. At the same time, the Republicans wished to get even for the mistreatment they had suffered for 40 years. Excuse me. But there were occasions when Gingrich would simply lash out for no apparent reason. One was after the House had passed the Medicare bill, which had been a very big fight for him, in which he had won. But he was so angry excuse me, at what he considered the Democratic distortions, some of which were distortions, about the Medicare proposal, that at the end of the debate, when he was to close and make a kind of gracious speech about what had happened, he really lashed out with hatred at the Democrats. There were a couple other times when something like this happened, which raised a question of his self-control. But Gingrich was always looking for new ways to do things, and he found many of them. It's hardly noticed. I think part of the problem of understanding last year, at the time it was going on, was that so much was happening at once. It was so fast and furious that it was just about impossible for the daily press or television to keep up with. And I think maybe it takes a book to actually capture the larger point of what was going on, as well as what was significant in all of this commotion. In effect, Gingrich abolished the seniority system in the House, which will have had and will have extraordinary long-term consequences. I'm sorry about this cough. I know where it came from. Excuse me. He built the most powerful speakership yet, and I don't see much reason to think that that's going to change for a while. At the same time, Gingrich was actually more pragmatic, more of a compromiser than his fellow leaders, and this is very important, explains a lot of what happened last year. Dick Armey, the House Majority Leader, is much more of an ideologue, a kind of principled conservative who believes what he believes, and that's that. He didn't much believe in compromise. And Armey was fascinating. You know, like Gingrich, he'd been a history teacher at some obscure Texas college. And so when I went in to see him, I would get this very enlightening education on what was going on and why. Army particularly liked cat metaphors. And he would say of a certain bill, well, the cat's never in the bag until the cat's in the bag. Or he would say, well, the cat's in the bag and the bag's closed up tight. I found this great fun, and I kind of kept a list of the Army cat metaphors. Then there was Tom DeLay, the House Majority Whip, the former owner of the Albo Pest Control Company. And he was really angry about government regulations. He believed it was his God-given right to use DDT. And he was simply not going to accept these regulations. And now he was in the majority and working extremely closely with the interest groups that backed the Republican Party. This was part of his role. He was determined to roll back federal regulations, and I think he succeeded more than is generally understood. And he was fighting also to change the very culture of Washington. He told me all about this in quite interesting detail. For instance, if a law firm in Washington wanted to send somebody up to see him, he said, don't send anybody unless he's a Republican. Or he would say, you know, I've gone through the roster of your firm and you don't have enough Republicans. This had some effect. Now, there's also this man named Bob Dole, who was in a very interesting and complicated situation. Bob Dole and Newt Gingrich had never had particularly marvelous chemistry. They're very different types of people. Dole is actually, in his heart, more of a centrist. He's more of a compromiser. He's very pragmatic. And as we know, his campaign has sort of suppressed it now, which I think has taken a lot of the fun out of Bob Dole. But he has quite acerbic sense of humor and wit. And before they sort of told him he couldn't do that anymore, he was making rather scathing comments about the contract with America, which Gingrich and his fellow leaders had put out as the program for the candidates who were running. And when the book deal, Gingrich's book deal blew up, Dole said, well, what goes around comes around, which wasn't the most supportive statement that he might have made. He had serious doubts about the contract, thought it was kind of written by a bunch of hotheads, didn't really take it very seriously, never thought that they could meet such a goal as, or set one, as balancing the budget. But Bob Dole wanted the Republican nomination. He knew or believed that the Gingrich wing of the Republican Party was very strong, if not dominant, in the Republican Party. And so he made his bargain with it. And he became, at least outwardly, the sponsor of the contract in the Senate. His allies were even told, don't criticize Gingrich because we don't want to stir up or alienate his following. And you saw for a long time all these pictures of Dole and Gingrich, with Gingrich issuing the pronouncements, announcing the strategy and even the tactics, and Dole standing there. And it certainly looked to the public as if Gingrich was, and to me, as for a while, Gingrich was leading Dole around by the nose, and it was faintly embarrassing. In fact, Dole was having serious doubts about all of this, even though publicly he was the loyal, almost lieutenant to Gingrich. And at one point in the fall, as Gingrich's poll rating started to plummet, and Dole's along with that, Dole told his aides, I don't want to be in any pictures with him. Towards the end of the year, Dole ultimately broke with Gingrich over the issue of the government shutdowns. He said publicly enough is enough, and he, in the Senate, pushed through a resolution to put the government workers back to work. And then an amazing thing happened, or that I learned about, which was Gingrich's fellow leaders really thought that Gingrich was being too malleable when he went to talk to Dole. And he would come back from a meeting with Dole and say, you know, Dole thinks we ought to do X, and I think so too. And they were seeing him as being much too influenceable by Dole. And Gingrich told a couple of his confidants, he said, you know, I have a problem with Dole. He reminds me of my stepfather, and I'm always trying to please him. This was hardly the public impression, and it was one of the more revealing statements that I have ever heard out of a politician. Well, what else went wrong? How did this trajectory go like this, with these two men's paths really crossing and them ending up in almost reverse situations? I think the first mistake was made early, when Gingrich and his colleagues, his fellow leaders, and perhaps them more than him, they more than him, interpreted the '94 election as a mandate for anything they've ever wanted to do. Everything. You know, okay, boys, let's go to town. We're in charge now. Let's do whatever we wanted. The contract legislation that was drawn up largely under Army went much further than anything that was said in the contract, which was barely recognized by the public anyway. Only about 12% said they'd ever heard of it, and only about 4 or 5 said that it had affected their vote. Nothing was said in the contract about Medicare. The word environment didn't appear. But when they wrote all these bills, they indulged their frustrations and desires. You probably heard a lot about how this contract was polled by Frank Luntz, this young pollster, and they would say, you know, how popular all these proposals were. That was actually a sham and a ruse. The leaders decided what was going to be in the contract and the legislation, and Frank Luntz simply he conducted focus groups, which is one of the scarier developments in politics, to see what words had what reaction. But the leaders wanted people to think, actually, that Luntz had polled the issues so that they would think that they were popular issues as opposed to the indulgences of the leadership who wrote it. The actual decision to use the contract as an agenda was far more accidental than people think. As the election was over and the session was approaching, Gingrich thought, well, now, what do we do for an agenda? I've got it, the contract. So thus became, sort of accidentally, this very, very fundamental approach to government and all of these many, many issues that they decided that the public had approved, which, of course, they had not. Meanwhile, down in the White House, the Clintons, both Clintons, were angry, upset, depressed because the election was widely interpreted, with some reason, as a repudiation of them. I say them because Mrs. Clinton's health care project had just gone down in flames, and her popularity ratings were really quite low for a first lady, in fact, at an all-time low. They were absolutely at a loss for what to do. They were angry if anybody suggested that maybe they had something to do with this. They began to convene seances at Camp David with all sorts of gurus, a guy who walked on coals and things like that. And so it took them quite a long time to recover from this. Meanwhile, what was at stake were issues involving everybody, every one of you, really everybody in the country, because everything was up for grabs. Things that people had taken for granted for a generation, the cleanliness of the air we drink, air we breathe, the water we drink, all sorts of environmental protections. The very idea of a safety net for the poor in the welfare program was out there for dispute. and it really nearly got torn apart without, I might say, much opposition from the president. Progress in education was up for grabs, and it still is. I point out in the book, and it doesn't make a lot of liberals very happy, that to some extent they brought this on themselves by not having made distinctions and made choices in all of the years that they were passing all this legislation. When John Kasich, the young chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, House Budget Committee, a mailman's son from Columbus, Ohio, one of the brightest people in the Congress, and I think you'll be hearing more about him over the years. But when he would say there are 163 jobs programs, and he was dead accurate, you saw that there was a problem here, and he certainly had a point, that there had been almost a mindless, I know I'm inviting attack here, but mindless expansion of programs without an accompanying weeding out. So liberals were now paying for their failure to be discriminating. When Gingrich said he wanted a whole new debate and to repeal the New Deal, what he really wanted to do was get rid of as many federal programs as he could, and underneath that was another goal that he rarely talked about but was clear, and that was to smash the national liberal lobbies, who he saw correctly as the epicenter of the resistance. And he thought if he could destroy their power, he could destroy much of what was going on in the federal government. He saw himself in terms sometimes as a general in this great battle. Sometimes he was George Marshall, sometimes he thought he was Eisenhower. At one point he thought he was the Duke of Wellington. In the Napoleonic Wars, it sort of depended on the situation. But this was a deadly effort on his part. He was very serious about it, as were a number of the other Republicans. They tried to pass some legislation that truly would have put a crimp in the power of the lobbies. And also through trying to kill the programs, he was trying to kill their power. So there was a circular thing going on there with one very, very central goal that was about as important, no matter what side you were on, as any issue that's ever been debated. He was right. It was the biggest debate since 1933. One of his strategies, which looked very smart at the time, and I think was partly attributable to his sometimes genius, was to move these issues through the House as passive. He declared 100 days, which oddly enough goes back not just to FDR, but the 100 days after Napoleon's return from St. Helens and then back to Elba when things didn't work out so good. Why this is considered a good model, you'll have to ask him. But part of his strategy was to have this battle go on about 100 fronts at once, keeping the enemy divided and confused and unable to gain the time to gather the power of opposition, or what his press secretary, Tony Blankley, said to me was the constant rat-a-tat-tat of our bills. They just simply aren't going to have time, like we did on health care, to decide what the issues are, run focus groups on the issues, make ads, mount a campaign. And so during these first months, the president at the White House staff, the lobbies who stood for these programs were really at a loss because everything was happening too quickly. I think the press was a bit at a loss too because so much happened so fast. In fact, one night in the House, it didn't make the papers, but they were debating a crime bill, and one of the feistier Democrats offered an amendment to put into this bill the language of the Fourth Amendment, guaranteeing the safety of one's own home, and the Republicans voted it down. Meanwhile, at the White House, the president was still depressed. There were long meetings and debates and arguments over what to do, how to handle this extraordinary situation, whether to fight, how to fight without looking too negative. The public was sending conflicting instructions to both Clinton and Gingrich. They were A, stand on principle, B, get things done. This put both of them actually in a difficult spot. Finally, there was a turning point in the spring, near Easter of 1995, when the House Republicans cut the school lunch program. Now, if Gingrich were here and he had an umbrella in his hand, he would hit me over the head with it and say, I've been trying to tell you, which is, he thinks he has a big beef on this with everybody, it's not me. We didn't cut the programs, we slowed the rate of growth. This became a very big issue. What they did was, yes, increase the amounts for some of these programs, but they didn't increase them enough to keep up with the growth of the population who would have been covered by these programs or inflation. So in effect, it was a cut. Whether that was right or wrong, it was a cut. And Gingrich would just go mad, and he became extremely angry, especially when Democrats and members of the press who are not the C-SPAN audience notwithstanding the same thing, would say he's cut the program. One of the reasons this was a miscalculation on the part of the Republicans was that the school lunch program reaches the middle class. So it wasn't just cutting for the poor, who really didn't have much of a constituency in this Congress or in the public, but for the middle class. And the White House said, at last we have a great issue, and they went to town and they held up ketchup bottles in a reference to an obscure incident in the Reagan administration. But mainly it made the president feel good. Finally he had an issue, he knew something to argue about, something to say, and so on. This became such a sore point among the Republicans, who constantly argued not that they had made any kind of political move, but that their communications on it weren't good enough. Everything is blamed. Democrats do the same thing, I might add. Politicians never make a mistake. The communications aren't good enough, and the press doesn't understand it. This was such a sore point with them that it became, there was a new verb coined in the English language. Haley Barbour, the Republican National Committee chairman, warned the Republicans when they were beginning to think about the upcoming Medicare fight. He said, we're going to be school lunched on this. So this new transitive verb became part of the political language, and he was actually dead right. Once again, I mean, Gingrich and his press secretary would call in clumps of reporters and instruct them, we are not cutting Medicare, we are slowing the rate of growth. You must not say cut, you must say slow the rate of growth. And of course, the Democrats paid no attention to this and said that the Republicans were cutting Medicare, which looked at one way they were. The Republicans said, no, we're spending more for it, which looked at another way they were. But of course, it was politically, it was a losing argument for the Republicans. At the same time, Gingrich made a very big decision, and that was, after the balanced budget amendment, the constitutional amendment went down in the Senate for lack of one additional Republican vote, Gingrich decreed, we're going to balance the budget anyway. Dole thought this was impossible. John Kasich was very nervous about it and said, is this written in stone? And so Gingrich said, yes, it is. And it became really never the law of the land, but it became the law of the land in effect, in the sense that Gingrich convinced the president, the Congress, and imposed on the country there will be a balanced budget. This was not just an arithmetical nicety, it was the foundation of his goal of getting rid of as many programs as possible. He felt if this vice was put on them, there would have to be a weeding out of programs, and he was right, and in the end, Clinton went along with this. There was much talk about how Clinton was, quote, standing on principle in the final negotiations, but in fact, he was willing to make many more concessions than his vice president, much of his staff, and his congressional leaders wanted him to. Because the Republicans had their own constrictions in how much they could bargain, and because the Republicans were becoming impatient because Clinton, this former political stumblebum, was having the better of them throughout the negotiations, because like a lot of people, they had failed to take into account Clinton's wiliness as a politician, because like a lot of people before them, they mistook Clinton's agreeableness for agreement. A lot of people have left the Oval Office or gotten off the phone with Clinton thinking, oh, he agrees with what I said and he's going to do it, and they would come back and find out that that wasn't the case at all. Gingrich became so furious about this that he finally said, I don't even want to be in his presence anymore. So the talks broke off, and as you know, Clinton came out politically very far ahead, and Gingrich's poll ratings continued to go down. He's now the most unpopular politician in America, which is a championship of sorts. I think that he actually accomplished a great deal more than he's given credit for, than he even gives himself credit for, because it'll be a long time before a president does not present a balanced budget. The appropriations, the money bills are still moving through Congress or not moving, and they've kept the agencies funded at lower levels than they had been, and so it has been their own. They have actually put the clamp on many federal programs. Regulatory agencies are much more cautious now because they want to keep their money. So this failed, it is considered, quote, revolution, unquote. I think it's had much more effect on our government than people realize. There are a few morals to this story with which I will conclude. One is, for the politicians, don't overreach. I think if they'd chosen a few more carefully selected goals, they probably would have gotten a lot further. For the public, I would advise you, beware of the truisms. Gingrich is a genius and he will be a maximum leader forever. Clinton can't put a foot right. And all such truisms, if you hear it often enough, you should think, well, actually the opposite is going to turn out to be the case. And I think the third really important lesson from all of this, if anybody has ever had any doubts about it, it is that elections matter. Certainly the 1994 election mattered, and it came about in part because a lot of people assumed it didn't and stayed home. And there has been, as a result, at least a partial shifting of the direction of our federal government. A lot of these issues are now going into the 1996 election, and I think maybe now we all understand that elections do matter. There is no room for cynicism. If anything, it is irrelevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. At Elizabeth's request, she's going to remain standing at the podium, and I'm going to remain seated here as the moderator. And I think she will discover that, to use a Dick Armey metaphor, that when people come to the Ford Hall Forum, the cat ain't got their tongue. So they will be asking questions, and we do invite you to step to the microphone to ask some questions. And my role as the moderator will be to make certain that the cat ain't got your tongue, but it doesn't rattle on too long, and that the goal here is to ensure that as many of you who wish to ask questions can ask questions, and we can have a discourse, which is what makes the Ford Hall Forum so unique. So our first questioner.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for coming. I have a question about the Christian Coalition and their role, and groups like them, and their role in the rise and slight fall of Newt Gingrich. Could you talk a little bit about that, and also about Christian Coalition-like groups and their role in Bob Dole's presidential campaign?
Well, that's a good question and a big one. simply said the Christian Coalition, which is it's also often termed the religious right, was founded by Pat Robertson after Jerry Falwell's moral majority hit the floor. Pat Robertson is obviously a very shrewd man because he put not himself out front, but as this angelic-looking young, he's not as young as he looks, very smart man, Ralph Reed, who looks like the kind of guy that, I mean, how can you possibly, disagree with him or not like him? He's actually very bright and a very engaging guy, and I think he's obviously an extraordinary sense of power. The Christian Coalition is increasingly taking over state Republican parties. They work from the grassroots up, and it's hard to say exactly how many state Republican parties they now control, but undoubtedly it's more than half of them. These are the people who turn out intensely in elections. They pass out scorecards of churches, put them on car windows just before an election, and they don't say who to vote for. They just score the member on his voting on abortion and other issues of importance. They are a very, very powerful force, and this makes them a very powerful force within the Republican Party, and thus far an increasing one. Dole, in order to get the nomination, kind of made a pact with Ralph Reed. Ralph Reed was smart enough to not go public and say that he was supporting Dole. It was kind of an agreement to not be against him, and in exchange for which Dole took certain positions like anti-abortion or pro-life that were different than he had taken before. And I think he kept quoting his mentor, Richard Nixon, who from his grave couldn't really tell us otherwise, but he said that Nixon told him, run for the nomination from the right and then move to the center, which is something Nixon had done, but in the days of the Christian Coalition, I think that's a lot harder to do, because these are the people you want energized. At election time, they were one of the 3 or 4 major groups behind the Republican takeover of the House. And again, Reed was very smart. He agreed with the Republican leaders that they wouldn't bring up the subject of abortion during the 100 days because it was very controversial. It was not in the contract. But the deal was, like the deal with the NRA on the assault weapons ban, to bring it up after the 100 days. So you've had these votes on partial birth abortions, which are among the hardest things to be for, of course. So they are a force. At the moment, they are still a growing force. These things tend to ebb and flow. And so I can't predict where they'll be 10 years from now. But right now, they are a real power in the land.
Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you also for coming on my behalf. My question is this. Well, actually, I want to tell you, I had a mental image when you were talking about the umbrella, and all I could think of was Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner on the floor of the House just before the Civil War, that caning incident.
It hasn't come quite to that.
I hope not. My question is this. Well, I was in your part of the topic of your lecture was the reaction of the Clinton administration to the 1994 election, or lack of game plan should the results turn out as they did, which I found very disconcerting, to not be able to fall back on your real fundamental core beliefs and what you believe is right, and using the presidency as the bully pulpit that it should be, having the strength of your convictions. What do you see as the game plan, so to say, or the issues that will frame the debate for the election? Trent Lott was quoted in the Globe, and probably all over the country today, as saying that they have a big move coming that will shift the whole debate, as if the contract with America they know has become a superfluous sort of albatross to them. What do you see as the next big thing?
There is a lot more floundering around going on among the Republicans right now than they would like to let on. Therefore, you get announcements of things like that. some very basic decisions haven't been made and are even the subject of contention within the Dole camp. They thought, and Dole said, as you all know, the Globe had a good piece about it today, that Dole, being this very, very effective congressional leader, could campaign from the Senate floor. He was out of funds. This would show that, as he said, he could get things done. He must have had an attack of amnesia because he seemed to forget how hard it was to get things done in the Senate, even when the Republicans are in control. Because of the filibuster rule, you really need 60 votes, enough votes to cut off a filibuster on any issue. And this was why a lot of the contract items stalled in the Senate. It was very difficult for Dole to get a welfare bill out of the Senate, but he did. So the kind of argument that goes on now among the Republicans and within the Dole camp, for example, is should we pass another welfare bill and send it to Clinton and show that he's vetoing welfare? The argument goes, though, that right now they argue against that is that we now have him on record as vetoing a welfare bill. And coming out of those budget talks, the Republican leaders had, a new respect for Clinton's political deafness, and B, thought he was one slippery fellow. So Dole, who now enjoys calling Clinton Veto Bill, there's a real concern that they might pass a welfare bill and Clinton will sign it, which is the last thing they want. So I think it's going to be a lot more ad hoc-y as the year goes on than they would like to have us think. You referred to the Clinton White House being somewhat the same way, and that's true. Right after the election, his aides started saying, well, you knew they were having a lot of meetings and the seances I referred to, and they said, from now on, what Clinton's going to talk about and propound are the things closest to his heart, what he really believes in. A, it suggested that he hadn't done that up till then, and B, one wondered then what were all the meetings about? A yellow pad in a couple of hours should be all he needed to do that. One of the things about elections is there's always some issue that comes along that you can't predict and seizes the spotlight, and I'm not clairvoyant enough to tell you what it's going to be, but I'm honest enough to tell you that I don't know what it's going to be, and it's one of the reasons, as I say, elections are always so interesting, because it's a long time between now and November in election terms. It's about 9 months, and a lot of things can happen that we can't anticipate.
From your observations over the past 3 years, could you describe the relationship between President Clinton and Vice President Gore? They always appear to work well together, and that they seem to be in agreement, and they're both obviously very intelligent people. But Gore in his career has not been afflicted with Clinton's disease to please. Are there just as many, are there conflicts that people close to the White House are aware of? Are there areas in which Gore may prevail and others in which he just stays away?
The Gore-Clinton relationship is the most extraordinary president-vice presidential relationship there has been. Gore has more access and influence and more of a real role than any of his predecessors. And whatever one thinks of both of them, I really thought it was to Clinton's credit that he was secure enough to pick someone arguably as smart as he is, an attractive political figure, had been a potential rival. Gore has been smart enough to play that situation right. But there's really almost no major decision that he's not in on. He picks his arguments, but when he makes them quite forcefully. Sometimes they're in agreement with the president, sometimes they're not. Sometimes he chooses not to, go to war against the guy who was at the top of the ticket. An example of that was Bosnia. In the first couple of years, Gore was for a much more forceful policy, and while he argued it in the policy meetings, he didn't mount a big campaign. He was for the president's going for a balanced budget, which put him at odds with Leon Panetta, the chief of staff, George Stephanopoulos, and the Hill leaders. And in that case, he was with the president, but he was also a force for getting it done. On the other hand, in the negotiations, he thought Clinton was going too far in his talks with the Republicans. So he's both freer to speak his mind, and he does it. And he does many political chores for the president. It's an exceptional relationship. I think this kind of thing started with Carter and Mondale, but Clinton and Gore have carried it further. It's a good precedent, but this will very much turn on the personality of the president himself as to whether he wants that kind of relationships. Most presidents haven't been secure enough to have them.
Could you comment as to whether Jesse Helms has had much practical effect on the way we've conducted our foreign affairs in the last year?
That's a really good question, because there are so many ways to for Mr. Helms to have an effect without our even knowing about it, because there's so many things he can do quietly. The State Department and Secretary Christopher in particular have worked very hard to not have him be too beastly towards it. And frankly, I'll just tell you candidly, we can't know all of the concessions that may have been made in order to bring this about. I think it is still the case, if there's an ambassador who might be named that he doesn't want, he can have a big effect on that, and he certainly can if they go ahead and name him. There are all kinds of ways. I wrote an article about Helms a few years ago, again when he was chairman of the committee. Republicans controlled the Senate, and I found that not just Helms himself, but his staff or his advisors could play a very big role in blocking appointments, warning the State Department if they do this or that, there will be trouble. Now, some things he out and out, has tried to do, which is reorganize the agencies. He hasn't quite accomplished that yet, but he might. He has ways of striking terror that do not result in anything we know publicly, but which can really have an effect. He's up for election again this year. It'll be quite interesting to see. He has won very narrowly, but that's going to be one of the real fights in this year's campaign.
On behalf of the Ford Hall Forum, I'd like to thank Elizabeth Drew for a very enlightening and enjoyable presentation. And I also wish to advise everyone who's here that Ms. Dole...
Happens all the time. Let me stop you a minute. When my last book came out, I was on CNN, and my husband taped it, and I ran home to watch it, and there I was talking to Judy Woodruff, and I was identified as Elizabeth Dole. So if anybody makes the reverse slip, I'm just delighted.
Well, I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I've made the mistakes on the dates and on the names, so with that I will conclude and thank all of you for joining us this evening.